Hello. So as usual, let's begin by having a look at a finished graphic before we start the project. And you can see there's a lot going on here. We have got two lines animating in and out, and they interact with three sets of titles. And then we have masks that bring the whole effect together by hiding elements and revealing elements, but also as decoration and flourish as they sweep in from the left and right. All the elements for our graphic are here in these groups. We have a paths group, a titles group, which make the main graphic. Then we have a main title group, which is almost our last step, and this group here, which holds all the masks. Now for this project, I'm providing you with a project file to get us started, and it's available in the link in the description. And the reason for that is that what you're looking at here, everything this graphic is built on comes from just two curves, and we adapt those curves step by step. And if I was to begin the tutorial, the how-to guide, by drawing out the curve, then it's kind of guaranteed that somewhere along the line you will end up with a slightly different result than what I'm presenting. And that slightly different result, after a few steps, is going to start to produce a graphic that looks more and more different than what I'm presenting you, and you're going to get really frustrated and annoyed with that real soon. So I thought the best thing to do would be to get everybody starting in the same place, and so you can be confident that with each step you're going to get the right result all the way through. If you do go to the link for the original After Effects graphic source, you'll see it just comes from an advertisement for an After Effects titles pack. And so for this particular graphic that I'm trying to reconstruct, there was no associated tutorial. So all the timing and font size and all the numbers, statistics for the project, I kind of had to work out by eye. But I think if you do check out the graphic, I think we get pretty close to the actual After Effects graphic itself. One last thing is the project file comes from Motion version 5.4 as I updated when 5.4 was released. So hey, I'm really sorry if you haven't updated to 5.4, the project file's not going to be very helpful for you. But if you are interested in doing this one, please let me know in the comments, and I will update this how-to guide with another section to get everyone started with some curves, so then you can jump in at the right place and join us. Alright, that's enough of me talking, let's get into the project. So here we are in the project file to start, and let's have a look at what we've got. So we've got our masks group, which we're going to fill up soon, a titles group, our paths group, and a background group with the color solid. So let's open up the paths group and have a look. We've got the upper and lower element animating in. Now the upper element comes in on the first frame and is animated over 2 seconds, and the lower element comes in on frame number 5 and finishes at 2 seconds 5 frames. So they're both a 2-second animation, with the lower one offset by 5 frames from the top element. Having a look at the keyframe editor, you can see these are the two curves that I was talking about, and by adapting these curves we're going to get pretty much every other element apart from the titles that we need to make the graphic. So let's get into it. I'm just going to turn off the lower path for now, and we're going to start by making the mask for the upper path. So I'm going to duplicate the upper path and drag it into our masks group and rename it as the upper mask. And so what we have now is this copy is sitting on top of this copy. I'm going to come in and change the color so that I can tell them apart. And I'm going to bring the playhead to the 4th frame make sure my upper mask item is selected. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Shift left bracket to move the in point. And so now you see I've got one element coming in after the upper path has begun, and that's beginning our mask. So you can see in the inspector that it's the last point offset that is animated here, and to create the mask we want to give this same curve to the first point offset, but we need the first point offset to begin a bit later. So we're going to bring the playhead to the 8th frame, sorry, no, the 7th frame. In the keyframe editor, drag around your curve, right click on any node and select copy. Come to the inspector, select that first point offset, right click and choose show in keyframe editor. Select it here, add a keyframe, and now Control V to paste that curve onto the first point offset. And in the keyframe editor here, make sure you bring it back to animated so we can see both the curves. And what we're looking at here is our first mask. Okay, so now I'm going to take the upper path, right click and add an image mask, and I'm going to add the upper mask that we just made to that and set it to subtract. And the last thing I'm going to do is grab that upper mask and pull the edges up and down a bit. And so that is the first element finished. So now we're going to kind of repeat that step for the lower path. I'm just going to turn the lower path on now, but we're going to work back the other way. But we're going to build the mask in pretty much the same fashion. So I'm going to take the lower path. I'm going to Command D or right click and duplicate that. I'm going to drag that into our masks group, and I'm going to name it as lower mask. I'm going to move the playhead now to 8 frames. And make sure the lower mask item is selected. I'm going to use the Shift left bracket hotkey to reset the endpoint. And again, I'm going to change the color of this element so that I can keep a track of it and see how the mask is shaping up. And so that's what we have. So again, we want to give the same curve, this time to this element's last point offset. And we want that curve to begin a few frames later. So I'm going to bring the playhead now to 11 frames. I'm going to copy this curve by dragging around it. I'm going to right click and select copy. In the inspector, I'm going to select now last point offset, right click, show in keyframe editor, and select that now. Set a keyframe and Control V to paste that curve on. Then I'm going to bring everything back to animated again so I can see what we have. Now we have our second mask in place. So I'm going to select that lower path and right click and add image mask. Now I will add the lower mask and set that to subtract. And again, making sure it's selected, the lower mask. I'm going to just adjust the width up and down here so that we get a clean look. So pretty much that's step 1 completed. And now we can get in and add some titles. Okay, so select the titles group in the layers panel. I'm going to add a new group and drag that into the titles group, and I'm going to name this group the upper title. And with that group selected, the upper title group selected, I'm going to grab my text tool and add our first text. So I'm just going to use title line as the text element. Now here's maybe, I don't know, it's an oddity about this project, but one of the obvious masking effects in this project isn't a masking effect at all. We are just going to give our title text the exact same color as our color solid. So I'm going to select the text, and for the color I'm going to use the color dropper here and color my text that way. And so it appears that we're masking the text stencil style to the line, but actually we don't need to. Just keeping the text as the same color as the color solid will give us the look we want. Alright, so this text I'm using Hiragino Kaku Gothic Standard as the font. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that's the font that we're using. We're going to go for font size 60, and we're going to put the tracking at 20, and I'm going to center this text, and I'm going to choose the anchor point and shift that anchor point up into the middle before resetting the X and Y values. Alright, so let's position it. Now, this particular line, the upper title line, has an endpoint of 1 second, I think. So let's move our playhead to 1 second and use keyboard hotkey I to trim that to 1 second. If I turn back on the timeline, you can see it in there. And I want, at 1 second, I want this, no, let's go forward to 2 seconds, 20 frames, and that is where the title line comes to rest in the actual graphic. So we're going to set it up here. The Y in the inspector, we want it sitting on Y45, and X at -12. And so now we want to have this title keyframed in from the 1 second mark. So here with these settings in place, Y45 and X at -12, and make sure the playhead's at 220. Set a keyframe here for the X position. And now let's bring our playhead back to 1 second. And you can set the X position now to 390. So now we've keyframed the title to come in. So we want, just going to turn off the timeline editor so I can focus on the keyframes here. We want this title, just in keeping with the AE graphic that I'm trying to reconstruct, we want this title to rush in and settle slowly. So I'm going to adjust the curve to get that look. And so you want something like this. Okay, so now that is our first text element in place, looking as it should. So now it's time to mask this text element. So we're going to do now the upper title mask. So to do this, I'm going to select the upper mask that we made before, and I'm going to turn it on. No, I'm not. I'm going to duplicate it and turn on that copy, and I'm going to rename this as the upper title mask. And make sure this upper title mask is turned on. And what we want to do is come into the inspector, and for the last point offset, just reset that parameter. And now we're going to take that upper title line text, right click, add an image mask, and we're going to use the upper title mask as the source and put the blend mode to subtract. So that's our upper element pretty much finished, and now so we can do the lower title mask, lower title and the lower title mask. So to make the lower titles, I'm going to grab the upper title. No, first of all, I'm going to make a new group in the titles group, and I'll rename that as the lower title. And so now I can grab the upper title text, duplicate that, and drag that into our new lower title group. And I'm just going to amend that just so that it says lower in here so I can tell it apart. And I'll get rid of that image mask on there for now. So this lower title line has an in point at 1 second 5 frames, or 1 second 10 frames actually. Right, so let's get our playhead to 1 second 10 frames. Make sure the title line lower is selected and use keyboard I to trim that to here. And then we want the Y value for this line at -45. So it's sitting down there. And it has the same resting point at 2 seconds 20. So let's move the playhead to 2 seconds 20 frames. And we want the X value at -12, just like with the titles for the upper layer there. And now we want to keyframe these titles to come in from the other direction. So with the playhead at 220, before we go any further, most importantly, with title line lower selected, reset the keyframe. Now we'll add another keyframe and set the position at 2 seconds 20 frames at -12 as it should be. Now with the playhead at 1 second 10 frames, we want to set the X position at -500. And we want to adjust the curve now as well, so it rushes in and settles slowly. So I'm going to grab this curve, and it's coming in from the other side, so we're going to adjust the curve in the other direction. And you're going to want something that looks like this. Okay, so that is the lower title taken care of, coming in, and now we want to mask it in pretty much the same way that we did with the upper title mask. So I'm going to grab that lower mask that we made earlier, duplicate it, turn it on so we can be sure of what we're doing, and just going to rename this as lower title mask. Come to the keyframe, come to the inspector, and we want to reset the first point offset. And now get the lower title group, select the lower line text element, right click, add image mask, and use our lower titles mask as the source. And set the blend mode to subtract. Okay, so now we want to animate the last point offset of the upper and the lower line to come back now. And to do that, we're going to transplant the lower paths curve onto each element. Now they start animating back at 2 seconds and 5 frames. So let's get the playhead there to begin with. So we want to come to 2 seconds and 5 frames. And let's do the upper path first. So in the paths group, select the upper path. We have animated the last point offset in, and now we want to animate the last point offset out. So with the with the playhead at 2 seconds 5 frames, come into the inspector, select last point offset, or we can do it down here, select last point offset, set a keyframe. Come to the lower path, lasso them, draw out a selection, right click on any node and select copy. Come back to the upper path, make sure it is selected here, and if we Control V, we've just pasted the curve on, and so we should have that last point offset beginning to animate back now at 2 seconds 5 frames. Okay, now we want to do the same thing for the lower path, but with the lower path we need to activate the last point offset. So select it, make sure your playhead's still at 2 frames 5 seconds, select the lower path in the inspector, select the last point offset, right click it and select show in keyframe editor to make it present here. Select it in the keyframe editor, add a keyframe, now Control V, and bring the setting here back to animated so we can see what we've done with the lower path. And now you can see that over 2 seconds the upper and lower path are going to animate back together in unison. So let's have a look at what we have so far. Okay, so now we're doing well. We are ready to create the mask that will come back with the last point offsets. So to get ready for that, we need to make a new group. So first I'm going to close titles and close paths. Just going to select the project and add a new group, which I'm going to name as main graphic, and then I'll shift select titles and the paths group and drag them into that group that we just created, main graphic, and I'm going to command left bracket to bring them under the masks group. So now it's this main graphic group that we're going to apply a mask to. So we're going to start with the flourish mask first, which will come in at 1 second 25 frames. So let's get our playhead there at 1 second and 25 frames. And we're going to build that mask with the lower mask that we created before. So select the lower mask and duplicate that. Turn it on. I'm going to rename this as the greater mask in all caps. And we want to make sure that is selected still, and with our playhead at 1 second 25 frames, use the shift left bracket key to reset the endpoint. I'll shift the endpoint of that mask to 1 second 25 frames. And it's turned on and it has a separate color, so it's just about ready. What we need to do is increase the width of this mask so that it covers the upper element as well. Alright, so now we can grab the main graphic group that we just created, right click there, add an image mask, and drag in our greater mask that we just made as the source, and set the blend mode to subtract. Okay, so the next step is another mask. And what we want to do now is have a mask that comes back and masks out these titles. And to do that, we are just going to adapt this mask that we put in place just before. So grab that greater mask, duplicate it. I'm just going to rename it now to greater titles mask, and turn it on so we can see it. And all we want to do is reset the first point offset here, and we're ready to go. So I'm going to grab the titles group, right click, add an image mask, and the source here is our greater titles mask. And we can just leave that blend mode to add. We don't need to set it to subtract at all. Okay, one more step to do before we go any further, and that's in the After Effects graphic that we're reconstructing here, and this final greater mask, the cosmetic mask, it actually is a bit wider, so we're going to come into that greater mask, come into the keyframe editor and choose the group as animated so we can see it. Okay, and we want to isolate the last point offset, so just turn off the first point offset in the editor so we can just see the last point offset. Now I'm going to use this transform keyframes tool and drag a box around this curve, and so as we had it before, it comes in 3 frames after the first point offset, but we want to drag that back to just 1 frame, so let's get the playhead at 1 second 29 frames, drag our box to come back a frame, and so that should give us, there we go, we just get a bit of a wider effect on that flourish mask coming back now. Okay, so that is the first main element of our graphic all completed, so now we're ready to add the main title. So I will add a new group now, and I'll call this group main title, and I'm going to add some text. In the inspector, I'm going to set the font size to 85, and I'm going to center the alignment, and I'll right click in the text element, grab its anchor point, drag it into the middle, and then I'll reset the X and Y values. So let's bring our playhead to 3 seconds and 5 frames, and hit keyboard I to trim this text element to 3 seconds and 5 frames. And now bring the playhead to 5 seconds, which is where the text will come to settle. And we want the Y value at 0, and we want the X value at 10. And so let's set a keyframe here for the X value, and bring the playhead back to 3 seconds and 5 frames, and set the X value now to -400. And as before, we want to adjust the curve so that this element rushes in and then settles, but not quite as fast a rush as with the other elements. Okay, perhaps in a bit faster. Okay, so now we want to add a mask to this text element. So let's come back to our mask group and grab that greater titles mask that we made before, and right click to duplicate it, turn it on, and I'm going to rename this one as the high mask. And what we want to do is link the last point offset of this mask to the last point offset of the lower path, our original lower path. But first we want to, good to go. So I've got the last point offset here. I'm going to add parameter behavior link, and I'm going to come to my paths group and drag in the lower path as the source, and in compatible parameters drop down the menu, choose object, shape, outline, last point offset. And now we can select our motion title text and right click to add image mask, and use the high mask as the source, and set to subtract. Well, we're almost finished now. All we have to do is add one last mask to finish the graphic that animates in. So let's get the playhead to 3 seconds and 5 frames. So you can see that we've got this extra part here that's not covered by the mask. So I'm going to grab the main title group and grab my rectangle mask tool and just draw out a mask to snip that part off that's visible and set that mask to subtract. Now at the 3 second and 5 frame mark, I can see there's just a little bit of that text encroaching there, so I'll come and grab that text itself, come into the properties, it's keyframed at -400, just drag that back a bit, just for nicety's sake. Right, so we have completed the graphic that animates in. And so what we want to happen now is for everything to reverse and animate out. So let's get ready for that. I'm just going to close all the groups and I'm going to select each group and move my playhead to 5 seconds. And for each group I'm going to use the keyboard O to trim everything back to 5 seconds in the timeline. And now I'm going to add a new group to the canvas and I'm going to call this animate in, and I will shift select the main title, the mask group and the main graphic group and drag them into that group, and I'll select that group and see that it's trimmed to the 5 second mark. So after 5 seconds we should see nothing. Okay, except for the background. So now I'm going to right click the animate in group and I'm going to select make clone layer, and making sure that clone layer group is selected. With my keyboard I'm going to use the shift left bracket key. So the clone begins where the animate in graphic finishes, and come into the inspector in properties and down here in timing. If you don't see the settings, just click here show to turn them on, and make sure the clone layer is selected, and then yep, you should see the option here in timing for reverse, and we should be good to go now. And so that's our reconstructed After Effects graphic for this time round. I think it should be quite clear to you that in this walkthrough guide I've been making a lot of mistakes and getting really confused with my own notes. I think you can see I've stopped and started from various points. But so I hope with all the masking that was done in here that you picked up something useful if you are just like me, just getting into motion and finding out how things work. And as always, you know, it's really important to say that the graphic you're seeing in this how-to guide, it's not my own original work, so clearly it comes from a very talented designer who produced those After Effects titles. That's that. I hope this was useful to you with your future projects, and thanks for watching.